NFL Week 2 wide receiver and cornerback matchup grades. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. Taking a look at all the matchups for this week, or at least most of them. If I miss someone, or looking for the Monday night game, hit me up Twitter in the comment section. I'll let you know. But going through easiest to hardest as far as matchups go this week, we'll start off here with the Cardinals. Going back to the well with Larry Fitzgerald, he saw 13 targets in week 1. Obviously, Carson Palmer looked god-awful. I still think he's capable of at least helping out Fitz there, especially with David Johnson being out of the picture. I think Fitz is once again a lock for double-digit targets. So Fitz, going back to last year, 68% catch rate, balls thrown his way, 0.34 fantasy points per route run. Going to see Nate Hairston for the most part in the slot. Not particularly a good match or a matchup for Hairston. So TJ Green, Rashawn Melvin. John Brown, I know he missed practice, but all these guys are certainly playable. I think Arizona's in a bounce back spot as far as the passing game goes to get things done. So definitely give them a look. Going into Julio Jones, take on what looks to be Demarius Randall for the most part as a primary defender, but overall, Devon House, these are guys. Both allowed over 0.35 fantasy points per route last year. Randall's targeted 23% of the time. Jones is obviously a guy who has torched Green Bay in the past when healthy. This is just an all-around good spot. You expect Jones to be one of the more popular wide receivers this week, but matchup aside, he grades out as one of the best on the board. So definitely look his way. Kelvin Benjamin, this guy who's interesting this year. One, because Carolina, I don't like what I saw from the passing game in week 1. It was very slow. It was a lot of rushing attempts for, guys like McCaffrey and Stewart. I don't know about upside in terms of Benjamin. If Buffalo can keep pace a little bit more, maybe it forces Cam to throw a little bit if he's even fully healthy. But matchup aside here, Kelvin Benjamin's always going to be a guy who has a size advantage. He has, 6 inches on Gaines here. Gaines is a guy who allowed over 0.40 fantasy points per route last year, 73% catch rate as well. Matchup alone, I think he's playable in GPPs. I'm not going all in, but he's an interesting play. His price tags aren't that bad, 5,600 on DraftKings, 66 on FanDuel. He might be worth a look in a GPP or two. So moving forward, Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders, both guys I do like here in this spot. Trevor Siemian, he looked fairly decent against a pretty good San Diego secondary, who we'll talk about later on. But overall, this is a decent spot here against a Dallas secondary. Yes, they look good week 1, but that was more just kind of the Giants looking absolutely awful. Now they go into Denver. Like I said, Trevor Siemian looked, played pretty well. I think Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas both have an advantage here on Awuzie and Carroll. I prefer Sanders a little bit more just from an ownership standpoint, playing him in GPPs, but you can definitely not argue with both. Sanders is on the cheaper side this week too, so definitely a contrarian option if you're kind of looking to go that route. I still think sub 15% on both those guys is in play. Moving on, Tyreek Hill, one of my favorite plays this week. Yes, he kind of has the boomer bust, tag next to him, but he looks to have avoided the week 1 injury. I believe it was cramps. He's a guy who does line up all over the place and is going to get his touches. I'm going to see probably Jalen Mills for the most part, 0.36 fantasy points per route run going back to last year. He's also been targeted more than any other Eagles cornerback at 24%. Chiefs have a fairly high implied total. I like Tyreek Hill. I like going back to the well here this week. I don't know if a lot of others are going to do that as well, but certainly an interesting look here, given the fact that, since Macklin's been gone, this is a guy who's put up pretty stellar numbers. So definitely like going that way. Moving to the Superdome, obviously all these guys get a terrific matchup on the New England side. Brandon Cooks, going to get the rookie there in Marshawn Lattimore. Cooks is a guy who obviously, he made way. It was basically Kansas City holding him the entire game. He just nothing you could do about that unless they do the same here. Cooks is in a good spot. Obviously, Danny Amendola, he's been a guy who's questionable for week 2. Chris Hogan, I'm interested to see what New England does with their passing game in terms of, using Chris Hogan, Philip Dorsett, James White. You kind of looking at what these guys do. But either way, Chris Hogan, fantastic matchup here. He was on the field quite a bit in that week 1 loss. Hogan's going to see PJ Harris. PJ Harris. This is just not a good spot here. Lattimore, obviously a rookie who is one of the higher graded, corners coming out of the draft, but I still think Cook's obviously very playable here. And even a James White at 4K, I mean, we saw New Orleans, struggle against pass catching backs as well. So I would not be afraid to throw a shot at him at 4K on DraftKings. So once again, good spot. Gronkowski, good spot. I mean, it's pretty simple there. Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, actually another good spot here. Pittsburgh's secondary I still think is a little bit iffy for me. Obviously the addition of Joe Hayden, I'm not exactly thrilled to see where that's going to be going. Apparently got a game ball week 1, whatever. But Corey Coleman, he looked pretty good against Hayden. Stephon Diggs, obviously when healthy, is shown to become one of the better wide receivers in the game. Pittsburgh, 32nd in DVOA against wide receiver ones in 2016. I just don't think Hayden's going to immediately jump that up to a top half DVOA. Diggs, once again, did not get the price bump given the Monday game. 6,100 on DraftKings, 65 on FanDuel. I expect him to be somewhat popular this week. I think there are other moves you can go. I think even in that same game, Martavis Bryant's an interesting look, especially if Xavier Rhodes does shadow Antonio Brown. I haven't seen any official reports, but I would expect that to be the case. It just would make the most sense. But then again, this NFL coaching, they don't always do that. So Trey Wayne's, the far weaker cornerback here for Minnesota, 0.35 fantasy points per route allowed last year, target 22% of the time. Bryant's an intriguing kind of pivot off of Diggs and Thielen, who I actually expect to be more owned, and obviously Antonio Brown, who we'll get to in a little bit, is going to draw some ownership as well. But other guys you can certainly look at, Doug Baldwin, Seattle dud in week 1. I expect their ownership to be rather low for a team with a very high total this week. Going up against slot corner Quan Williams, not particularly thrilling. Baldwin's been one of the better fantasy wide receivers dating back to last year, catching 76% of his passes, averaging 0.40 fantasy points per route run. Good spot there with Baldwin. I like him. Once again, like the price tags on him as always, 67 on DK, 76 on FanDuel. I don't mind going that route. And staying on the West Coast, Amari Cooper, intriguing option. I mean, he saw a ton of targets in week 1, a lot of red zone targets. He saw 14 overall. Wasn't a great, success rate. He didn't catch a ton of them, but definitely an interesting play here against the Jets secondary. Justin Burris, Claiborne, I'm not exactly thrilled with those two guys. They're going to be in trouble. Near 2 touchdown favorites, one of the higher totals as well. You can look at Cooper once again, who might fly actually under the radar. I think a lot of people are going to go with the running game there with Marshawn Lynch this week. So given the fact that Oakland does like to spread around, Crabtree, Derek Carr, Cooper, I think are an interesting stack there too. So one guy that, obviously a big week 1, Cooper Kupp, strong debut, 56% of his routes run from the slot. Saw Kendall Fuller. Kendall Fuller was actually graded fairly high, but Nelson Aguilar had a decent game out of the spot. Fuller's the guy who did struggle a little bit last year. I mean, 77% catch rate allowed, 0.35 fantasy points per route run. Not particularly thrilling. I think Kupp's an interesting plug and play once again. If you're going that route, especially in the later games, if you're playing that 4 p.m. only slate or something like that, I think he'll be somewhat popular. But looks to be that he's going to have a pretty predominant role in this line and this offense, so I don't mind going that route. Once again, the 4 p.m., take a look at Jarvis Landry. He's going to dodge the bullet of not facing the tougher corners here, getting the fact that, he's going to avoid Casey Hayward, Jason Verrett. So that's definitely on the better side of things. He's going to get Trevor Williams, who allowed 0.31 fantasy points per route run. Pretty average numbers. Obviously, dodging Hayward and dodging Verrett are two of the better corners. So Jarvis kind of looks out there. We'll get to Devontae Parker, Kenny Stills, who have the tougher matchups to handle this week. So not exactly looking at those guys, but I think Landry's an intriguing option, especially more on PPR sites if he gets that volume this week. So that's kind of going to wrap it up for the top ends. As far as like the middle guys go, Kendall Wright, if you're doing this dance again, I'm not, saying play all these guys, obviously, but I'm just kind of giving the matchups. Kendall Wright, if you're going back to the well there and kind of hoping for more targets, Robert McLean, 85% catch rate last year, 0.35 fantasy points per route run. Right, might get tossed up into some more targets. Obviously, it wasn't an exciting offense. It was just more the Cohen show, and that's about it because they're incapable of throwing the ball down the field. Decent option. Don't love them. Don't know how much money don't know how much exposure I'm going to be having with Wright this week. But but there's definitely other options to go with that I rather see instead of Wright. But if you're building a ton of lineups, I don't hate the move. Nelson Aguilar coming off a 6 for 86 in one line, took a 50-yard reception to the house. Definitely encouraging from a guy who's been kind of labeled a bust for most of his career so far. Hasn't really gotten going in that offense, that can continue. Danny Amendola torched this Kansas City defense out of the slot in week 1. Phillip Gaines, 0.40 fantasy points per route run allowed last year. Alshon Jeffrey should be seen on Terrence Mitchell, who's the weaker out of Marcus Peters. Marcus Peters, not a guy who shadows, playing 91% of the snaps on the left side. If that's the case, Jeffrey should be lining up away from him for the most part. I think those guys are both intriguing options. A tough matchup, obviously, against Kansas City, just given the fact that they're in Arrowhead is just a tough place to play. There's that factor in there. Obviously, the loss of Eric Berry is going to be a pretty significant play on that defense. So if Wentz can come in and sling the ball around again, I definitely don't mind those guys. And if people are going to be off of them, I think they make for great contrarian options. Let's talk the Packers here. In terms of one-on-one matchups, it's not particularly thrilling, but it's just more this overall offense, you don't really worry about it too much. You look at Jordy Nelson, Desmond Trufant is probably going to see most of. Randall Cobb's going to see probably mostly, obviously, Brian Poole out of the slot. Cobb is still cheap, saw huge targets last week, 14, caught 9 of them for 85 yards. If you read the article last week, I talked Cobb being my favorite option. I know Nelson did find the end zone, but it was on a jumped off sides play call where he could just wing it up there. But you look at Trufant, this guy, he just doesn't get thrown at. I mean, 13% target rate going back to last year allows only a 59% catch rate. Those are just not great numbers. I mean, Poole, 69% catch rate. That's still better than, obviously, Trufant. Not saying I'm avoiding Nelson. I just think Cobb, and you can look at Devontae Adams. Those guys are going to avoid Trufant. So, obviously, this team's going to put up points. Obviously, I'm not going to just fade Nelson. He's just kind of in this middle tier for me. Obviously, Ty Montgomery is going to be the best play from this game, just given his price tag and the fact that Atlanta struggles tremendously against pass-catching backs. We saw week 1. We saw in 2016. So a good spot there for really all those guys. New Orleans side of things, staying on those high-scoring matchups. Michael Thomas, fairly mediocre matchup here against Malcolm Butler. Obviously, a guy I don't usually like to target. And especially given the fact that New England just takes away your best, weapons. We saw it with Kelsey. We're going to see it with Thomas this week. And I'm not even particularly thrilled with Ted Ginn. I mean, Stephon Gilmore is a guy who still a less than ideal matchup. I mean, Kobe Fleener, the pass-catching backs, I think those guys are in play, obviously. But, I mean, Gilmore, 0.21 fantasy points per route allowed going back to last year in Buffalo. I mean, if Breeze, shows up and plays like he does at home, obviously these don't matter a ton. But I am putting a little bit of stock in here that maybe we do see kind of a mediocre matchup, and we get some of these guys. Ingram catches one, Kamara catches one, some Lutz field goals. I mean, it just all kind of depends. There's a lot of variance to the Saints offense right now that's really not that great. Sending away Brandon Cooks, Willie Snead suspended. Outside of Michael Thomas, I think he's going to need a little help. I'm okay with Gilmore, with Ginn, taking some shots on him, given the fact that his price tag is still pretty cheap. Michael Thomas is still a guy that I will have some exposure to just because he has that potential to go off. But, he's the focal point of this offense now. Teams are going to key up for him, where last year, not so much. He was able to run a little bit wild, where Cooks was the guy teams, dialed up the schemes for. So do note that. But I think they're in play. I'm just not exactly thrilled with their individual matchups. Keenan Allen, one of my favorite plays this week, saw 10 targets against Denver last night, found the end zone. I mean, when healthy, this guy racks up receptions and targets. Chargers coming off, I think, are a sneaky week 2 stack. They're underpriced. Allen's going to be a guy who moves around from the slot and left side more often. Bobby McClain, Xavier Howard, 2 average at best cornerbacks, a pretty good PPR floor here for Allen. I like him quite a bit this week. Mike Evans, next one here in the middle range. We're talking about some more predominant wide receivers in the game. Watch Chicago basically take away Julio Jones in that week 1 matchup. They did that a lot last year too, just focusing in. Mike Evans, obviously a mismatch for most wide receivers, or for most cornerbacks. If Prince Amukamara is healthy, held wide receivers to 0.2 fantasy points per route run last year, 61% catch rate. I still like Evans given the physical mismatch, and still against any cornerback, he can still dominate. I think 7,700 on DK is really intriguing still. especially if people are off of him, because I know people are talking down just because Chicago has limited wide receiver ones in the past. You might be able to look at a Deshaun Jackson on the other side, who I think is an interesting GPP play this week, given his home run threat ability to take one to the house. I can definitely see Winston airing it out a little bit this week. I like Tampa as a stack still. I liked Mike Evans quite a bit on the slate breakdown. I'm kind of walking back the more I dug into it, I'm kind of walking back a little bit my exposure. But I do like him still as a pivot off of some of those other guys. Antonio Brown, he's kind of one of those guys who's been matchup proof for most of his career. Still going to see a lot of Xavier Rhodes this week. Obviously he's on par with basically the best corners in the game. Gets a really tough test this week. Going back to last year, Rhodes, 0.20 fantasy points per route run, 48% catch rate allowed. Stellar numbers. Rhodes just is a guy who I just don't like to target. Interesting to see what people are going to be doing with Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell in non-optimal matchups this week, just on paper. But obviously, I think a drop in ownership will happen a little bit. I still think Martavis Bryant is a nice piece of this game to get, hopefully those targets and hopefully those snaps come back this week. Same thing with Bell. But overall, Brown's still a guy who you play. It's just a matter of, does the matchup lower your exposure? For me, that's probably going to happen a bit. So. Terrell Pryor, last one in this middle range, heavily looked at in week 1. Pryor's another guy. He's a big mismatch, but the problem is this week, Tremaine Johnson, one of the larger corners in the NFL. I worry about this spot in Washington as a whole. Pryor is probably more of a guy I would actually toss into the next group where I might be looking to fade. He might actually probably drop them down right now. So look at Johnson, held opponents to just a 59% catch rate, 0.21 fantasy points per route run. Pryor did see 12 targets. He only caught 6 of them. Had a lot of opportunities to have a monster game. That could be the case again here. Los Angeles is probably going to be looking to control the clock a little bit here. If Goff can keep the ball out of Washington's hands, Washington's going to be in trouble here, and I think this passing game is going to be trouble to start the year. So Terrell Pryor, looking more of a fade here this week for me, the more I kind of dig into it. Maybe a share or two in GPPs, but that's about it. He kind of just narrowly dodged this next one, because we're getting into basically the guys that are in the toughest matchups of the week. We'll start with Des Bryant. Going to see Aqib Talib, going to see Bradley Roby. Not good matchups for basically a Dallas offense that doesn't throw the ball that much. Bryant might pop off a few big games this year. I just think the upside really lacks compared to the other kind of elite wide receivers, if you want to toss Des into that name. Roby, Talib, both held opponents to under 52% catch rate. Both were targeted less than 18% of the time. I think if you want to play someone from Dallas, you're playing Ezekiel Elliott, given the fact that Denver was vulnerable against the run last year. I know Melvin Gordon had the most efficient game, but still found some success. I think Zeke can as well behind that line. So definitely going to pretty much avoid Dez, and I think I'm going to be avoiding Dez in most weeks. Next one here, if the quarterback situation in Indy wasn't enough to keep you off, the matchup for T.Y. Hilton should. It's going to see Patrick Peterson look to shadow him. He usually follows the elite wide receivers. And Jacoby Brissett expected to start from what I last read about 20 minutes ago. Still not enough to get me on Hilton. There's going to be time to use Hilton here on a low ownership play some week in the near future. This is the week, definitely not. Peterson targeted just 12% of the time. You saw Detroit do a very good job of just avoiding him completely. Given the fact that he's held opponents to under a 0.20 fantasy points per route run against him, we can fade there. Moving on, Marquise Goodwin, Pierre Garçon, tougher matchups, obviously going up against Seattle. This is a really good front seven. The secondary is obviously going to benefit from that as well. Richard Sherman was questionable. Still don't think it's enough for me to really look at Goodwin or Garçon here. Those guys are obviously looking at fades. If you're playing the 4 p.m. slate and you're kind of playing a game theory and hoping that Goodwin or Garçon can get some garbage time and get something, sure. On a main slate, there's no real need for me to go that route. The Tennessee-Houston situation this week, definitely interesting. Jalen Ramsey, I know he missed practice today. I'm not sure about A.J. Bouye, but both missed practice on Thursday. If they miss more time, and miss, both of them, or if one of them misses games, Tennessee's wide receiver stock goes way up. You look at Corey Davis, he was a shocker for me in terms of targets and snaps that week. I wasn't expecting that many. Rashard Matthews clearly still a role in this offense. Eric Decker's probably the odd one out for me now that we saw one game. I know it's a small sample size. just Decker didn't really thrill me all that much with how he played. But Bouye, I mean, this is a guy who will see probably Corey Davis. Rashard Matthews will see some Ramsey if healthy. Two corners that are ranking top 10 for me this year that I'm just not really going to be excited to play wide receivers against. Could they have potential to pop one off? Sure, especially Davis with his long ball threat. But for me, I'm not really going to be going that route if they're healthy. If they're not, sure, I'll take some more shots. On the other side of that one, Allen Hurns and Marquise Lee. This is one where Logan Ryan probably going to be on Allen Hurns. And if we're looking at Marquise Lee, Adoree Jackson, obviously he was targeted a lot against Cooper, but I think that was more of a Cooper thing. Still a rookie. I think Marquise Lee is an intriguing dart throw as a wide receiver 3 this week, but really nothing more. It's still Blake Bortles, still an offense that's going to run it, an offense that's going to run a ton. So I'm not really excited about that one. Back to the West Coast, last few guys here, and then we'll wrap things up. Devontae Parker, brutal matchup against Casey Hayward. Hayward's been a guy who's been really solid in the San Diego, 0.23 fantasy points per route run allowed, 57% catch rate. Hayward, one of the top-rated corners by PFF last year. Jason Frey is another one I just don't like to target. I know he was questionable, but should be fine for week 2. If not, I still am not playing Kenny Stills. Like I said, Jarvis Landry's going to get Trevor Williams. He's going to get the easier threat this week. So I'm fading those other guys. I'm just not looking to use the Dolphins this week. I like their offense moving forward. I like Jay Ajayi. I like Jarvis Landry, but that's it for me. No one else. Jamison Crowder, disappointment in week 1 alongside basically all those Washington guys. Tough matchup against Nickel Roby. Slot corner who just a 55% catch rate and under a 0.25 fantasy points per route run. Crowder's a no-go for me this week. I'll fade there. Last one here, Jermaine Kearse. Kind of guy who I'm borderline on in terms of the matchup. We're going to see some Sean Smith. Not an elite corner, but certainly, he's been beat before. But there's more talented guys than Jermaine Kearse. But if he's going to get these targets, I think we have to give him a look. Smith, pretty pedestrian, 0.30 fantasy points per route run, but was only targeted 15% of the time. The catch rate's also at 50%. Kearse is at 60 going back to last year. I mean, Kearse is just not a good wide receiver. If you want to play in game theory against Sokotina, it's going to be locked up for most part, sure. But outside of that, I'm not really thrilled with the matchup or looking to get much exposure. So that's going to wrap it up. If I did miss someone or you're looking into a situation I didn't cover, shoot me a note and I'll get back to you on that. And good luck this week.